Filing a lawsuit before the United States Supreme Court is not something that we do lightly.
To think that my name is going to be in the records of the U.S. Supreme Court, that's an unusual thing.
These are two people you might not pair together, a Triangle realtor and the North Carolina Speaker of the House. But their names will be forever linked.
I'm just leaving a message on your voicemail.
Becky Harper is a realtor.
So any news about your brother?
She's been selling homes in North Carolina since she moved here in 1993.
One of the things I love most is the joy that comes with helping first-time buyers actually get into a home.
This first day of session is always one of almost exhilaration.
Tim Moore is the Speaker of the State House.
It's an opportunity that we all have to serve our fellow citizens.
He's been in this leadership position for 8 years.
North Carolinians want us to put partisan politics aside.
But he was first elected as a state representative in 2008.
I didn't get a chance to come up and speak to you.
Outside of the General Assembly, he's a lawyer. But these days, much of his time is dedicated to his legislative role.
I really enjoy events like this, particularly coming to this group. I mean, these are folks, men and women in law enforcement, who every day put their lives and their own personal safety on the line.
Their names are linked because of the United States Supreme Court, which agreed to hear the case Moore v. Harper. It's a case about redistricting and whether the state courts have the authority to override legislative maps.
I am part of a group of plaintiffs. I am the named plaintiff, and so like other famous cases that we've studied in U.S. history, my name will be on this case.
This isn't Harper's first interaction with North Carolina elections and the law.
I filed a complaint with the North Carolina State Board of Elections, and it had to do with campaign finance issues. I felt as a realtor that I was being forced to pay for political activity that I did not personally support.
That's when she first connected with Common Cause North Carolina, a nonpartisan group focused on political rights, like voting rights and gerrymandering. She's now on their board of directors.
The case we have next is Harper et al. Versus Hall.
Harper was part of a group of voters who sued the State House Redistricting Committee, saying Republicans' maps violated the state constitution. The North Carolina Supreme Court ruled the maps needed to be redrawn.
I care so much about reforming our system so that our elections are actually competitive. I got involved in this because I felt that gerrymandered districts were such a huge problem, and I would like to see elections that are actually contests where people talk about their ideas and their proposals for how to move the country forward.
Then Speaker Moore appealed the theory behind the decision to the United States Supreme Court, citing the independent state legislature theory.
And of course, the Supreme Court, in taking our case, signifies that they believe it is a significant issue. Of course, the lawsuit we filed simply makes the point that under the separation of powers, the state constitution gives the legislative branch the right and the responsibility when it comes to redistricting, and that it is not appropriate for the state judiciary to interfere in that. If the framers of our state constitution thought that was appropriate, then they would have written the state constitution that way. So we simply believe that that's what ought to happen.
This is a case that could have big implications, but it's a complicated issue. UNC law professor Bill Marshall explained to me how we got here and where we could be going. What is the independent state legislature theory, and how does it tie into this case?
Well, the independent state legislature theory is a theory which says that the legislature is the absolute final word on issues like redistricting, and that the legislature's decision cannot be changed by the governor by vetoing it, or cannot be changed by a Supreme Court by interpreting it in the light of state constitutional provisions. It says the legislature is the final word.
And has this ever been brought before the U.S. Supreme Court before?
The U.S. Supreme Court has dealt with it a little bit in a case from Arizona in which created an independent commission to draw districts, and the court upheld that and said that didn't interfere with the independent state legislature actually didn't interfere with the constitutional requirements. So they were not accepting the argument that the legislature is the final say on these issues.
What are the implications for North Carolina and other states? First, in the fact that the Supreme Court is even hearing this case, but if they side with Speaker Moore in the North Carolina legislature?
I think they're pretty dramatic, because usually we think about the legislature as being checked by the state judiciary. And what this does is literally take all the checks off the legislature. It says that the legislature doesn't have to abide with the judiciary's interpretation of the state constitution and how that might affect the legislative action. So it's a pretty significant decision.
And so for someone who is not well versed or even really paying attention right now in North Carolina or in another state, why should they be paying attention to this case?
Well, because if it says that the North Carolina legislature is the be-all and end-all on the meaning of these voting kinds of concerns, then legislatures in other states may be more aggressive in the way they enact particular provisions, because they know they're not going to be subject to state Supreme Court review. Now, I have to make that clear. They can still be subject to federal constitutional review, but they would not be subject to the limits in the state constitution.
For the most part, Harper's life has continued as normal. She isn't involved in the legal battle, but she's now helping to spread the word about the case that's putting her name in the history books.
We want the citizens of North Carolina, and in fact the citizens of the entire country, to understand how important Moore versus Harper is.
A long 2-year legislative session is wrapping up, and Speaker Moore is already getting ready for another session to begin early next year. But he and state leaders across the country will be watching in December to see how legislative powers are interpreted by the High Court.
The fact that the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear the case shows there's merit. I mean, of the thousands and thousands of cases that go before the U.S. Supreme Court, only a handful are ever heard. So to be one of those is a big deal for North Carolina, and I'm certainly proud to be a small part in that, but I'm really excited for what it means for the voters of the state.